Imagine this. You're in court, maybe the worst day of your life, and suddenly, it's not just about the facts. The other side starts talking about who you dated years ago, what you wore last Tuesday even. Well, really private stuff. How fair does that sound? Kind of chilling, right? Welcome to the Deep Dive. We dig into complex topics to pull out what really matters. Today, we're looking at a really important Supreme Court decision from earlier this year, January 21st, 2025. It's Brenda Andrew versus Tamika White, Warden.
Yeah, and our goal here is to unpack how this case forced the Supreme Court to, well, reaffirm a basic idea of fairness in our justice system, something called the Due Process Clause. It sounds technical, but it's basically about ensuring everyone gets a truly fair shot in court.
Exactly. We're going to follow the story of Brenda Andrew. She was convicted of murder, sentenced to death, and her appeal basically became this flashpoint over how we interpret the law, specifically what counts as fair evidence in a trial. It's a wild ride.
Yeah.
Accusations, personal attacks used as evidence, and ultimately the Supreme Court stepping in.
It really shows how these big legal ideas directly impact real people's lives.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It starts back on November 20, 2001 in Oklahoma. A man named Rob Andrew was shot and killed in his garage.
Right, and his estranged wife, Brenda Andrew, she was there too, and she was also shot, but in the arm. Her initial story was that two masked men attacked them.
Now, Brenda and Rob were separated. They had 2 kids together, but Brenda was dating someone else at the time, a guy named James Pavitt.
And that relationship becomes pretty central later on. After Rob's death, Brenda Andrew and James Pavitt, they traveled to Mexico together.
Which, doesn't exactly look great when your estranged husband has just been murdered.
No, it definitely raised suspicion. They became the main suspects. Eventually, Pavitt actually confessed to shooting Rob Andrew with a friend's help. But interestingly, he specifically said Brenda Andrew wasn't involved in the actual shooting.
But despite that denial,
both Pavitt and Brenda Andrew were charged with capital murder. They had separate trials, and both were convicted and sentenced to death. And it's Brenda Andrew's trial that really sparks all the legal controversy we're talking about today.
Okay, so what happened at her trial? The prosecution's case was basically that Brenda Andrew and Pavitt, who happened to be an insurance agent, conspired to kill Rob to get life insurance money.
You'd think then the trial would focus like a laser on proving that conspiracy, right? Connecting the dots, showing the plan.
Yeah, the motive, the opportunity, the means.
But that's not quite how it played out. According to the court records later examined by appeals courts, the prosecution spent a lot of trial time bringing up details about Brenda Andrew's personal life. Things that seem, well, pretty far removed from a murder plot.
Like what kind of things?
Testimony about who she'd slept with over like 20 years, what outfits she wore out to dinner, or even, get this, the kind of underwear she packed for a trip.
Wait, underwear? How is that possibly relevant to whether she conspired to commit murder?
Exactly. That was the core of her appeal later. Witnesses were apparently brought in just to testify she dressed provocatively, and the prosecution asked questions like, would a good mother dress or act like that?
Wow. So it became less about the crime and more about painting her as a quote-unquote bad woman.
It certainly seems that way from the appeal documents, and it carried through to the closing arguments. Prosecutors apparently held up her thong underwear for the jury, talked about affairs from college, said she had sex on her husband over and over while seeing Pavitt.
So really hammering the character angle.
Absolutely. They even contrasted her with Rob, the victim, saying he was committed to God, implying, that her character made the crime somehow worse or her defense less believable.
Okay, so she's convicted, sentenced to death after this trial filled with, let's say, questionable evidence. What happens next? She appeals, obviously.
Right. First to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, the OCCA. She argued all this irrelevant stuff, the affairs, the clothes, the coming on to witnesses' sons violated state law, and crucially, the U.S. Constitution's Due Process Clause guarantee of a fair trial.
And what did the OCCA say?
It was a mixed bag, really. They actually found the evidence about her affairs was okay. Their reasoning was kind of startling. They said it showed Pavitt was just the last in a long line of men that she seduced, and this somehow showed her motive and intent, like she hated her husband and shared that hatred with these men.
Okay, that's a take. But what about the other stuff? The clothes, the underwear?
That's where even the OCCA admitted they struggled to see the relevance beyond just attacking her character. The state itself, the prosecution, apparently agreed in the appeal that most of that evidence was irrelevant.
So they admitted errors were made. Did she get a new trial?
No. And this is the key part. Despite finding errors, the OCCA said they were harmless. They believed there was so much other overwhelming evidence of her guilt that these errors didn't actually change the outcome.
The harmless error rule. Basically, yeah, we messed up, but it didn't matter anyway.
Pretty much. But not everyone on that court agreed. One judge, Judge Johnson, wrote a powerful dissent calling it an egregious pattern, just to paint her as a bad wife, a bad mother, and a bad woman. He felt it totally skewed the trial. Another judge would have just reversed the conviction outright.
So the state appeal fails. She then turns to the federal courts,
Yeah.
right, filing what's called a habeas corpus petition.
Exactly. It's a way to ask a federal court to review a state conviction if you believe your federal constitutional rights were violated. She made the same core argument. All that prejudicial, irrelevant evidence made her trial fundamentally unfair under the Due Process Clause.
And this works its way up to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. What did they decide?
They also denied her relief. But their reason was very specific and technical. They said she hadn't pointed to clearly established federal law from the Supreme Court that governed her specific claim. This is because of a law called AEDPA, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which sets a really high bar for federal courts overturning state convictions.
Okay, AEDPA. So she needed a Supreme Court ruling that directly addressed this kind of unfairness from irrelevant evidence.
Precisely. She did cite a case, Payne v. Tennessee from 1991. In that case, the Supreme Court said the Due Process Clause does offer protection if unduly prejudicial evidence makes a trial fundamentally unfair.
Seems relevant, right?
Yeah, sounds like exactly what she needed.
But the 10th Circuit disagreed. They said that statement in Payne was just a pronouncement, maybe an aside, but not the main holding of the case. And under AEDPA, only a clear holding counts as clearly established federal law.
Wow, so it comes down to defining what's a holding versus just commentary or dicta? Exactly. Legal semantics maybe, but with huge consequences. If it's not a holding, the federal court can't intervene, even if they think the state court got it wrong.
Was the 10th Circuit unanimous on this?
No, there was another strong dissent, this time from Judge Bacharach. He slammed the prosecution's focus on her sex life, calling her portrayal a modern Jezebel designed to make the jury distrust her based on loose morals. He argued it absolutely did deprive her of a fundamentally fair trial.
Okay, so this sets up the big showdown at the Supreme Court. The core issue is, did the 10th Circuit get it wrong about Payne? Was that due process protection clearly established law or not?
That's the heart of it. The Supreme Court had to decide if that principle that throwing in a ton of unfairly prejudicial, irrelevant stuff can violate due process was something the Supreme Court had already definitively ruled on.
And what did the Supreme Court say? It was a per curiam opinion, right? Meaning for the court as a whole.
Yep. Yes, per curiam. And they basically said the 10th Circuit did get it wrong. They looked back at Payne v. Tennessee. Now, Payne's main point was about victim impact evidence, sure, but the Supreme Court, in this Andrew decision, said the reasoning in Payne absolutely relied on the underlying principle that the Due Process Clause protects against fundamentally unfair trials caused by unduly prejudicial evidence.
So it wasn't just an offhand comment in Payne. It was essential to the logic.
Indispensable was the word the court used here. They said because it was indispensable to the Payne decision, it was a holding for ADPA purposes. It wasn't some new idea. They pointed to older cases like Donnelly, Caldwell, Darden, showing this principle was already established. They'd even applied it in later cases like Romano and cited it in Kansas v. Carr.
So a consistent line of precedent.
Right. They emphasize that clearly established law doesn't have to be a case with identical facts. General legal principles established through holdings absolutely count and apply to new situations. The 10th Circuit's view is too narrow.
So the final ruling was?
They vacated the 10th Circuit's judgment, basically wiped it out, and sent the case back down. They told the 10th Circuit, look, this due process protection is clearly established law. Now you have to actually consider whether the Oklahoma court unreasonably applied that law to Brenda Andrews' trial.
Okay, but like most big Supreme Court cases, there was disagreement, right? A dissent.
Oh, yes. Justice Thomas wrote the dissent, joined by Justice Gorsuch, and it was a strong one. He argued the majority was basically ignoring ADPA's rules, stretching precedents too far, and making clearly established law mean almost anything debatable. He thought the 10th Circuit got it right the first time.
And he focused on the evidence against Andrew.
Very much so. He spent a lot of the dissent detailing the evidence presented at trial to show why the OCCA might have reasonably found any errors harmless because, in his view, the evidence of guilt was overwhelming.
What kind of details did he bring up?
Things like, Rob Andrew had taken out an $800,000 life insurance policy, naming Brenda as beneficiary, through Payvet. Someone had cut the brake lines on Rob's car before the murder. Payvet allegedly told his daughter Brenda asked him to kill Rob. They apparently forged Rob's signature to transfer the policy. Brenda supposedly lured Rob into the garage right before he was shot. Plus, forensic evidence suggesting Brenda's own arm wound might have been staged powder burns, indicating a very close shot. Suspicious items found at a neighbor's where she had a key. The flight to Mexico. An alleged call she made the night before saying, "I hate him, I hate him, I hate him."
So Justice Thomas is painting a picture of strong guilt, suggesting that character stuff, even if improper, didn't change the outcome.
Exactly. He also argued that some of the sex-based evidence was actually relevant to motive or rebutted defense claims about her being a good mother. And he fundamentally disagreed that the Payne statement was a holding. He called it a one-sentence aside.
And he brought up another case, Estelle v. McGuire.
Right. Decided shortly after Payne, Thomas argued Estelle specifically left open the question of whether irrelevant evidence alone violates due process. So for him, how could Payne have clearly established a rule that a later case said was still undecided?
So it's a real clash over how to read precedent, how strictly to apply AEDPA.
Absolutely. A fundamental disagreement about the role of federal courts reviewing state convictions.
Okay, let's bring this home. What does this ruling actually mean right now for Brenda Andrew and for, the average person listening?
Super important point. The Supreme Court did not say Brenda Andrew is innocent. They did not say she automatically gets a new trial.
Right. They just said the lower court messed up by refusing to even consider her main argument.
Exactly. It's like the ref missed a potential foul and now has to go back and look at the replay. The 10th Circuit now must analyze her claim using the standard the Supreme Court just clarified from Payne.
So what does that analysis involve?
They have to look at both the guilt phase and the sentencing phase of her trial. For each, they have to ask, was the admission of all that irrelevant, prejudicial evidence so bad, so unduly prejudicial that it made the trial fundamentally unfair? And crucially, under AEDPA, the question isn't just, was it unfair? It's, could any fair-minded jurist disagree with the OCCA's conclusion that it wasn't unfair enough to violate due process or that the errors were harmless?
That fair-minded jurist standard sounds tough. They have to consider the evidence's relevance, or lack thereof, how prejudicial it likely was, any instructions the judge gave the jury.
Precisely. It's a demanding standard. They need to decide if the OCCA's decision was not just wrong, but unreasonably wrong.
So why should someone listening, maybe someone juggling work, kids, life, care about this legal back and forth?
Because this case is a really clear example of the due process clause in action. It's not just some phrase in the Constitution, it's a vital shield meant to ensure that trials are about facts and evidence related to the crime, not popularity contests or, frankly, slut-shaming. It prevents the system from devolving into character assassination.
And it shows how these legal interpretations, holding versus dicta, how broad a rule is, have massive real-world effects.
Absolutely. But beyond the courtroom, think about it in everyday life. How often are we swayed by irrelevant information when judging someone? Maybe a coworker's messy desk influences our view of their competence, or someone's unusual hobby makes us question their judgment on something totally unrelated.
Yeah, that's a good point. We make those leaps all the time.
This case is a powerful reminder to focus on what's actually relevant. Think about a performance review at work. You want it based on your actual job performance, right? Not on whether your boss likes your taste in music or what you did last weekend. That same principle of fairness, of sticking to relevant facts, applies everywhere.
It's about demanding a fair process, based on evidence that actually matters, whether it's in a capital murder trial or deciding who gets a promotion.
Exactly. It's about pushing back against judgments based on irrelevant, often biased character assessments.
So this deep dive really went beyond just one case. It touched on fundamental ideas of justice, fairness, and how we interpret the rules that govern our society.
It definitely leaves you thinking, how often, maybe unconsciously, do we let irrelevant personal details cloud our judgment of others? And what does Brenda Andrews' long journey through the courts tell us about our own responsibility to insist on fairness and due process, not just in court, but everywhere?
Something to chew on. What stand out to you from this case and the Supreme Court's wrestling match over what makes a trial truly fair? I always appreciate hearing your perspective.